Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Jupiter's Legacy. So, this is a very generic superhero show. Not very generic, a very bland superhero show. Right out of the gate, I would say that the visuals of all these characters are just every single bit of bland, and we have it to where some characters are interesting to look at, but a lot of the times I would also say it's very bland. We end up having it to where this show reminds me very much of if Sky High, the movie Sky High, had a sequel and Sky High went more of an adult like angle. To me, I would say that this show honestly has way too much going on. I do realize that Jupiter's Legacy is actually a comic book adaptation, but man, do I think that they try to bite off more than they can chew with every single episode. Really, and also I probably bit off more than I can chew to review 3 episodes, because good God, is there so much going on in 3 episodes. We not only have to showcase we not only have to showcase current time superhero slash villains of this story, but we also have to show uh, these same current time people also in a flashback, seemingly 100 years ago, from today. And so we end up having me being really just frustrated at the fact of like, man, like if you really like the utopian, man, is he gonna be just in your face consistently. Like, man, does he have a lot going on in this show. We really have it to where the utopian character is basically the morality police, and where we basically have this character, the utopian, really is going to basically say, like, I want to control everything. I want to control everything that everyone is doing, and we end up having it to where if somebody doesn't do something that he likes, he ends up benching them, or he ends up having to confront them about something that he doesn't like that they're doing. And it's like, well, oh well, like they're just gonna keep on doing it anyways. Or reasonably, you're gonna have it to where a lot of people are going to praise that person for doing that thing you didn't like. It kind of just gets ridiculous within the show, to where we end up having to have like Utopian having to have his little tantrum, or his little whatever, of him just being like all salty if everybody just like, yeah, I agree with you, Utopian, I want to go and actually give him the what for as well. Whatever, Utopian, whatever, man. Really, we have it to where immediately when we have these characters like the Utopian or Brainwave or Lady Liberty, immediately when I see them and I realize how horrible their makeup is to make them look older, I'm immediately just like, oh, okay, these characters are going to be used in a flashback way. And so these people do not look their older age, because they're, of course, only there for flashbacks. Within 3 episodes, I've had a lot more flashbacks than current time things, which I think is stupid. Because I'm like, I don't care. I could give a rip about any of these flashbacks, because they do not help me understand the current time character. Basically, any of these flashbacks that I've been seeing are a waste of time, because really they don't help me make current time things matter, or they just don't help this story in any way whatsoever, but to just be like, well, hey, we really wanted to do a time period piece in a superhero show. Look at us, we have all the money to just blow on a time period piece within a superhero show. Like, look how much money we have. Whatever. Um, Going into this show, I would say that this show is very bland. It's basically like its title. It makes no real rational sense. This show should have been called like Super Show or something, or a superhero show, because Jupiter's Legacy, I don't understand what that even means. As well as this show, I don't even understand what the show means. Basically, it's flashy. It kind of, at some points, has to give you this big payout in the episodes, or just kind of remind you, hey, these characters exist. Hey, remember this character? They still exist. But yeah, it's just, I think a lot of this show has to tie on to a family, and I guess that could be a good thing. But we also have it to where we not only have to show uh, the Sampsons, who are the Utopians family, but then we also have to go on to this guy named Hutch and his people that he hangs out with, and so on and so forth. There are going to be at points in time when I'm going to review this that I'm not going to know every single character's names. There is one episode where a ton of superheroes show up, and I honestly and truly feel like that was just a ultimate waste. I thought it was an ultimate waste. It's like, okay, so we build up these characters for no reason, uh, or we built up us getting to know certain characters for no reason, and so on and so forth. And it just feels like a lot of the stuff that we end up having to have backstory on feels like a throwaway, or characters that we have to invest in feel like a reason of why. Why do I have to invest in this character? Why do I have to get to know their whole backstory? Because they're probably going to be dead in 5 minutes after I get to know them? That's the nitty and gritty of this show. Is just like, well, hey, like you're just enjoying the ride, but justifiably, who cares about any of these characters? Don't invest in any of them because it won't matter. Just enjoy the ride. So justifiably, I would say that this show could be an enjoyable episode, but the whole flashback thing is really killing the show. The flashback thing is killing the show. We end up having to all of a sudden, bizarrely, like rip away from the characters that we've invested in earlier on into this show, to remind us that there seems to be still some of those people that you can still invest in, but then you have to invest in another group of people that I cannot understand why I have to invest in them. To me, it's just they should have they should have stayed on one boat, so to speak, with this show, but they didn't. They should have stayed with, okay, this Sampson's family, like we should have just stayed with them, and instead of going into like they should have stayed with current time Sampsons or whatever, because by the time that we'll actually get back to these characters and focus back on them, I won't even remember probably what had happened to any of those people. And plus, there's so many people that they added into one episode to where I'm just going to be overwhelmed of all the people that I'm going to need to know. And I hope that you can add just a billion more people for me to not care about. But anyways, I think it's about that time to go into spoilers. I'm going to try my best to review these 3 episodes because there is just going on. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So right out of the gate, we end up having reasonably me being severely annoyed with the Utopian. I honestly hate this character. I hate the actor of which that plays the character. Just because I am just like, man, they had to really just say that, like, this guy, like, there's a reason why we paid so much for this guy to be in this show. Like, I like Josh Duhamel, but not in this. If yeah, it's just so in the ways of which that I think I'm gonna have to review this is like how I care about the show or the episodes the most. So that will say like how I'm gonna break this all down. So we end up having seemingly there being a robbery of sorts via this armored car, and it seems there is uh, quite a few guys that are going and trying to rob this armored car. It seems like they are all wearing gorilla masks, and they are trying to go and steal from this armored car. And it seems that we end up having a character coming in, Kyle, called the Iron. The Iron. I want to say it's a flower name. Oh my god. The Iron Orchid. There we go. We end up having the Iron Orchid coming and intercepting these guys in gorilla masks, uh, trying to take from the armored car, and so she ends up taking herself and taking from them, and so we end up having the Paragon swooping in and trying to stop the Iron Orchid from stealing this money, and immediately we end up having the Paragon going and telling this woman, it's like, well, hey, like, uh, put your hands on your head and kneel down and like and I'm not gonna ask this twice. To where we have Iron Orchid, it's like, I'm sorry, like, are you sure you've got the right address? Like, are you sure you're in the right place? Like, dude, you're like a nothing character. And so we end up having the Paragon trying to fight out Iron Orchid, and so we end up having him eventually starting to have this back and forth thing, but it seems like the Iron Orchid is really just kind of an outmatch for the Paragon. So we end up having the Utopian swooping in to help his son, because the Utopian is the father of Paragon, who is Brandon Sampson, and the Utopian is Sheldon Sampson. So we end up having the Utopian coming in to kind of steal Brandon's thunder, and so the Utopian ends up trying to take down Iron Orchid, and he becomes fairly successful at it. And so we end up having the Utopian angry at Brandon because he's like, "Hey, you should have called backup. Like, really, you shouldn't have taken out this guy on your. You should have taken out the Iron Orchid on your own." And so we end up having it to where the Utopian is lecturing Brandon about him just like, hey man, we have all these superheroes at the disposal. Like, why don't you use them? And Brandon's like, well, yeah, but I want to do something on my own. Like, I want to be able to like I don't want to share the success every single time of someone I take down, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where reasonably the Utopian and the Paragon eventually end up going home, and so we end up having the Utopian talking to Lady Liberty, which both of these characters look way younger than they actually should be within this current time period. And I'm immediately like, well, yeah, they're just here for flashbacks. So we end up having it to where the Utopian is just kind of angry at Brandon because reasonably, eventually, Brandon will eventually be really, really strong like the Utopian, and eventually, uh, Brandon will have to be the Utopian at some point when Sheldon actually passes away. But we end up having it to where Sheldon is talking to Lady Liberty, who is Grace Kennedy Sampson, and just kind of mentioning how uh, he's disappointed in Brandon, how really he has like too big of a ego and stuff like that he like can't ask for help and so on and so forth, that he should just take things out on his own. And so we end up pushing on. So we have it to where eventually the Sampson family all go on to have dinner together, and eventually we end up having seemingly Uncle Walter or Brainwave come into the dinner to uh, just talk about Paragon going out and trying to defend the city and so on and so forth. And because it's all over the news, and we end up having it to where eventually the family is kind of slowly but surely waiting on another family member to come to dinner, which is Chloe Sampson. Because we end up seeing in a flashback that Chloe ends up actually using her powers to have a sonic scream of sorts to seemingly hurt two friends of hers. And we end up having the Utopian fly in to say that Chloe should not have used her powers, and that Chloe was doing some game and she was getting annoyed by these two friends of hers, so she just used her power on her friends. So we end up having the Utopian saying how bad that was to his younger daughter Chloe, and so we end up having Chloe just kind of running off, um, for them to eventually go and get ice cream, but then eventually the Utopian was busy, of course, going to have to go and fly off somewhere, so he's like, "Oh yeah, we'll get ice cream," and then he ends up flying off and having to save the day. So it's like, well, I guess we're not gonna get ice cream. So we end up having Chloe, who is finally to arrive at this Sunday dinner, and it seems that the family is kind of unexpectedly assuming or assessing that Chloe wasn't going to come to this dinner, but luckily she did. So we end up having Chloe come to this dinner, and I don't know, it seems like she was fairly drunk, or she was a druggie, or something along those lines. Like, it seems like she was under some kind of influence of something. And so we have Chloe who ends up coming to this dinner to mention that she is now a model of sorts, that she is doing some photo shoot, of course. And so we end up having the Utopian kind of, again with the morality police, asking her, it's like, well, what kind of a photo shoot is it? And we end up having Chloe, who's like, who cares what kind of photo shoot it is? Like, it could be me uh, wearing whatever I want. Like, even if I'm naked, like, who cares? We end up having the Utopian, who is basically just like, well, like, I've seen the last photo shoot that you did, and I wish that you would have had a lot more skin on, or a lot more clothes on, I mean. And so we end up having Chloe, who is just like, God, who cares? Like, who cares? Like, God, how, like, Chloe has to, I guess, have some rules and regulations that she has to live under with the Utopian. Kind of just makes her really just want to eventually just say, you know what, like, this is going to be the very last dinner that I ever come to, because I'm just sick of the Utopian, like, having rules and regulations of how I should live my life. So we eventually end up having Chloe ending up leaving dinner, and we eventually have Brainwave, who ends up talking to Paragon, and they're on the roof together, kind of just sharing a beer or whatever, and kind of talking about how things are going. And so we end up having eventually Brainwave, who is Walter Sampson, going uh, and telling Utopian, it's like, dude, we need to share a beer together. We need to go somewhere and talk about things, like talk about how things are going, because reasonably they are going to some sanctum of sorts to go and talk things out about how things are going within this world, how it seems that there are Nazis within this world, there is gangs and all kinds of things. They're kind of setting us up to help us understand who is a part of this world and who are enemies of it. And it also seems that they have to also reminisce about a character called Skyfox, who had left their group called the Union, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having it to where also Brainwave is also kind of like talking about how the Utopian is kind of seeing his family and stuff along those lines. Ba 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 ba. And also we end up having to also showcase both Brainwave and or Walter and Sheldon, kind of in their past. How we get to know that it seems that these two brothers had worked in this uh, like factory with their father, and eventually we end up seeing that things aren't actually going as well as they'd hoped, and so we end up finding out that it seems that uh, we find out that their father ends up going and walking off the ledge of this roof and killing himself. And so there is of course, reason for that via the next episode. So we end up going along, and so really just the important parts of this first episode is we also end up having this big, huge fight out. So we end up having this character who is named Dark Star or Black Star, who is to have gone to prison. It's showcased in some news report that he had gone to prison, and we end up finding out that supposedly Black Star had supposedly escaped from prison and is now on the rampage. It seems like this character has some antimatter heart or nuclear heart of sorts, and so we end up having us find out that um, everybody now has to try and scramble to take down Black Star. So we end up having some superheroes making it to this gathering a little bit late, but it seems like they are to be showcased before this whole big fight out ends up happening. Like the Utopian and Brainwave and a lot of the big superheroes end up making it there first, and then some other people are just kind of there to just like show up at the last second as a photo op kind of thing to just show like, hey, I was here even though I didn't do jack crap nothing. There seems to be one guy who ends up having flaming fists, who is to basically showcase who all is here and to name everybody off for everyone. And it seems like there is some other girl that is to seemingly be a part of uh, of this who seems to be attracted to Brendan. And so uh, we end up having this big, huge fight out to where there is just a ton of superheroes involved. We end up having it to where Brandon is to eventually talk to a superhero who has the name of Tectonic, I think, and he is Barry. We end up having Barry and Brandon eventually going to a club together, kind of sharing a drink together, and eventually just talking things out. And so we end up having that investment done for good reason, because eventually, while we end up going on to this fight out, we end up having a character like Tectonic ending up getting killed. Because he ends up using his attack, he ends up using his power, and we end up having that being a moot point against a character like Black Star, who ends up just kind of killing this character, as well as a number of other superheroes that kind of quickly end up getting killed along this fight. We end up having it to where these superheroes seem to be very much outmatched with Black Star, and it seems that we end up having at some point where there seems to be quite a bit of superheroes dying, but then we end up having Black Star seemingly doing his very nuclear like weapon and build that up. And so we end up having the Utopian that is seemingly under the boot of this character called Black Star. And so we end up having Brandon, who ends up deciding, well, this guy's going off. He's using a devastating attack that could kill not only everyone that is here, but a whole entire state of people. And so we have Brandon who jumps into action to go ahead and basically punch through this guy's head, punch through this guy's face, to where that instantly kills him. To where we end up having it to where reasonably the Utopian is like, oh my god, you should not have killed him. Like, that is not a thing that we do. If anything, you should have flown him up to space, or you should have, you should have choked him out. You should have done something. Like, you should not have killed him. And Brandon is like, well, he would have also done an attack that would have killed a large amount of people. And the Utopian's like, I don't care. Like, that's not a thing we do. And so And plus, there was a very interesting like moment where we ended up having Brainwave trying to get into the mind of Black Star, and eventually he does do so. To where eventually Black Star's mind is somewhere within Brainwave's, to where Brainwave has this like beach like mental thing that he's keeping Black Star in, while supposedly in current time the rest of the whole entire superhero group is beating the crap out of Black Star, and so we end up having it though that eventually. It seems that Black Star is so powerful that he ends up breaking the connection of him and Brainwave, and he ends up continuing on to fight with all of these people. And then eventually that's what leads to eventually Black Star ending up being dead. So we end up having it to where Brendan kills Black Star, and reasonably within the very next episode, we end up having the funerals of the fallen superheroes. And so we end up having a lot of people actually praising Brandon for killing Black Star. Funny enough, though, that was not actually the actual Black Star, because we end up having it to where the Black Star dead body was put into some part of a prison, and we end up having the actual Black Star coming in to look over what is to be his own dead body. And so they are trying to figure out exactly, like, well, is this a Black Star from a different dimension? Is this a Black Star from a clone version of Black Star? Like, what and how, why is this character exist? Like, why is this thing an existing thing? Plus, they also realized that that Black Star did not talk before. Like, Black Star did not talk. This new version did not talk. Where this other Black Star, when he came in to look over the body, he did talk, and this Black Star didn't. So they're trying to like figure out like what is this Black Star? Who is he? Like, who is this different variation? And Brainwave is like, well, there's only one way to understand that, and that is to basically dissect this Black Star, and I guess I'll have to go ahead and figure out how to exactly do that. So we push on to go back into the past a bajillion years ago, where we have the Utopian who is to find out that his father had made headline news that it seems like he was not paying his workers correctly, and that he was kind of keeping the money for himself, and so we end up having it to where the Utopian is very upset by this information, so he goes out of his way to find Lady Liberty, who seems to be the reporter of this news, and so he ends up saying, like, these accusations are false, you're lying about my father, and so we end up having the Utopian having a nosebleed during this whole argument, to eventually to where the Utopian ends up coming back to find his brother, to where Walter is to basically tell Sheldon, well, everything that this news article was actually reporting on is actually true. Walter actually looked into it, and surefire enough, their father actually was skimming off the top and was keeping a lot of money that actually was not his. And so we end up having it to where Walter decides for this company that they need to lay everybody off for at least the next 5 months. And Sheldon is like, no, we can't do that. Like, we need to keep we need to keep these people working. We need to keep them paid and everything like that. and Walter is like, no, that's impossible. So we end up having that scene go on, and so we also have it to where seemingly uh the third episode is, oh my god. I'm trying to do the math on what happens in the third episode to finish up or I'm trying to do the math of what happens in the third episode so I can understand the second episode. Oh my god, I might have to pause here for a second. Ah, okay. We also have it to where it seems that in this episode, we end up having the Utopian talking to Brandon and basically telling him that since Brandon ended up killing Black Star, that he is basically benched from doing any superhero duties. That Brandon needs to stay on the farm to try and clear his head. And we end up having Brandon going like seriously, you're punishing me from killing this guy? And Utopian is like, no, like don't think of it as a punishment. Like think of it as like you need to uh you need to reset yourself, and so on and so forth. We also have the Utopian that ends up trying to make some kind of amends with Chloe, and we end up having him going and seeking out his daughter to kind of still tell her, it's like, well, hey, like, why can't you do uh, a photo shoot that is uh, not as scandalous, and why can't you do something that um, is pure and clean and whatever, and like his good moral value photo shoots kind of thing. And so we end up having the Utopian bringing her bagels and stuff, and we end up having Chloe who ends up saying like, "Well, I can't even eat bagels because I can't have any gluten for this photo shoot," and so we end up having it to where Utopian is like, "Well, you can eat the bagels later. I'm just gonna leave," because we end up having it to where Sheldon is just like, God, like no matter how or like any way of which that I try to approach Chloe, Chloe's just gonna do Chloe. And like that's fine and all, but also like it's very frustrating to where Utopian wants to try to control everybody, but he can't, and he will never do so. So we also have it to where eventually within this episode we end up having uh, a character called Captain uh, Borges, who seems to have a daughter that is to be uh, filling his shoes, because basically she's the next descendant of this guy. And so we end up having this guy in a wheelchair uh, kind of having his daughter mention about she's kind of concerned about being a superhero just because of watching her friends die. But on top of that, like, she doesn't know how she can live up to being as good as her father, where her father says, is like, well, no, like, you're even better than I was. And yeah, like so, we end up having this father kind of boasting about her daughter to anybody that would hear it, and so on and so forth. And so we end up also having we also end up having it to where we end up finding out that in flashback, we end up having Sheldon Sampson, who ends up having a funeral for his father, and we end up having people, of course, giving speeches and stuff like that. We end up having Sheldon eventually going and seemingly having a seizure during his dad's funeral. And it seems that that seizure ends up giving him some information of sorts. And so that leads to the next episode where we end up having Sheldon, who is scribbling all this nonsense and scribbling all these pictures. And so that's when we have to have a character called George Hutchins, who is Skyfox, into this episode, as well as also having a guy named Hutch and a group of his associates going into this episode as well. So let's do the flashbacky stuff first. So, like I said, we end up having the Utopian, who is to be scribbling all kinds of nonsense and sounding all kinds of crazy. And so nobody can really understand heads or tails of what the Utopian is talking about. It seems like he is getting some information supposedly from his father to go to some location. Supposedly there's some location that has something to do with a windmill and some other kind of things. It doesn't make any sense. It's a jumbled mess. And so we end up having a rich guy who is George, who is to seemingly go and have 80 to 100 some odd eggs all be cooked to some degrees. And so we end up having George, who seems to be a very rich off person, but then eventually towards the very tail end of this episode, we end up finding out that it seems that all that fame and fortune is actually just smoke and mirrors, that actually he's about to just lose everything towards the end of this episode. So we end up having George eventually going and is to end up talking to Sheldon, and eventually he ends up seeing all of these scribbles, and he ends up seeing it as a puzzle. So he ends up connecting all of the scribbled pieces together and realizes that they are some windmill of sorts. And so when George ends up figuring out all of these scribbles and all this whatever, these doodles and whatever, we end up having also George kind of talking to Sheldon, and it seems that they can have common ground because it seems that Sheldon had talked about the loss of his father, and George can see the same thing, that he had lost his parents. It seems that his mother had gotten some illness that could have quite possibly been infectious, to where he couldn't see his mother even to where it was closest to the end with her. And with his father, it seemed like his father had died from some natural cause, some heart attack or something along those lines. And so we end up having George kind of giving something to Sheldon that eventually seems to have gotten him out of this craziness that he was in. I think George taking all the scribbles that that Sheldon had kind of gave him that sanity that he needed. And so when George ends up coming back to Sheldon, who Sheldon is now much more sane, talking to his girlfriend, it seems that everything is fine. We end up having George bringing Sheldon back these scribbles and talking about the windmill and talking about the scribbles that he had done, to where we immediately have Sheldon right back into that insane like moment where eventually he is still seeing his ghost of a father telling him things, and to where he is losing his mind yet again to go, I gotta figure out what this whole thing means. I got to figure out what's going on here, and dot to dot dot dot. We also seem to have a guy named Hutch who is to have this team of people together that he is going to go on his own and try to do a task upon his own. And we end up immediately having this group that is kind of very against him going on his own, because it's like, dude, are you just gonna like split from us like Phil Collins and Genesis, or Beyonce and Destiny's Child? And we end up having it to where Hutch is like, well, no, man, like, if anything, this mission that I'm on is really stealthy. The thing that I have to get is like really specific, and it seems that this guy named the Big Man seems to want very stealthy and very few people involved in this, and so reasonably we end up having it to where uh, we end up having Hutch going on to uh, going on to make it to this place, because he ends up having uh, some device with him, some kind of stick device, to where he ends up telling it where he wants to go and he can arrive there. And it seems that first off, we end up having a tour. It seems that Hutch has to touch this thing to be able to tell it where it has to do and whatever, but we end up finding out that that is actually incorrect. That it seems that this guy has complete control over this stick and or device thing. That it seems that whatever his word is to say, uh, the stick follows it. So like it looks more like a scroll thing than a stick, but like I guess I'll just call it the scroll. So we end up having it to where within this episode that we end up having Hutch going out uh, to this vehicle to go and get this uh, this suitcase or this briefcase that he needs to get. But it seems that when he is to go out and get it, it seems like there are two guys that are going and trying to get this as well. And so we end up having Hutch trying to desperately get to this, but then we end up having these two guys make it, and then the Utopian ends up arriving as well. To where Hutch is trying to scramble to try to get this, but he ends up falling short, to where eventually he ends up being forced to go and see the Big Man, where it seems that this Big Man character is killing somebody in the bathroom. And so we end up having this Big Man character being very intimidating to Hutch, basically telling him, it's like, well, dude, like, you better get me what I want, or like I'm going to kill all of you. So we end up having it to where now we end up having Hutch, who ends up going with his entire group of people to go out and get some kind of briefcase that has some things in it. And so we end up having them to go out to try to get this briefcase, and the entire time they are to try to avoid these brothers who seems to have these superpowers. And so surefire enough, these people end up running off to get this uh, briefcase, and they end up doing this in this bizarre like van that seems to have this ability to, if you hit certain windshields and if you hit the lighter of this car a couple times, bizarrely this car can like go through walls and all kinds of things. Like this is some magical van that eventually these people end up realizing it can kind of do any number of things or get them anywhere. We end up having one character who ends up wanting to go to Antarctica or something like that uh, because really this van could really just take anybody anywhere. So even to the point of just like, well, uh, like even if it doesn't make sense for this person to get that far, they can, I guess, with this van. So I guess this van could even like walk on water, basically, probably, I'm sure. So we end up having this group ending up, it seems that one of the characters ended up getting shot, and so seemingly one of the people used their burn powers to try to heal this wound or try to kind of figure out this wound. And so we end up having bizarrely these people trying to get away from these two brothers, and they end up smack dabbingly uh, getting into a car accident against Chloe Sampson. And so Chloe Sampson ends up getting to where she ends up putting a massive dent into this van. We end up having quite a bit of this group going out to see what had happened and realize that Chloe Sampson is there. And so this group starts to attack Chloe Sampson, and so they end up failing miserably because their powers are kind of like sonic powers, or their powers are just nowhere near match for how strong that Chloe is. And so we end up having it to where it seems that uh, that Hutch tries to get whatever he can from this briefcase, but it seems that also Chloe is trying to stop him. And so we end up having it to where Hutch just ends up deciding, like, dude, I'm gonna get out of here. Like, I'm just gonna, like, I'm gonna try as much with these people to just get the heck out of here because I don't want anything to do with Chloe Sampson. So we eventually have it to where the big man's goons eventually go after Hutch, and so we end up having it to where Hutch ends up going and giving this scroll like thing to one of these goons and tells the scroll to take him to shark infested waters, which it does. To where we end up having Hutch telling the other goon that, hey, like, I have control over this scroll like thing, and I can make it go wherever it wants or wherever I want it to. I have control over this, and no matter who has it, I still have control over it to tell anybody to go anywhere with this with this scroll. So we end up having it to where this whole entire thing was to go after some device that seems to be very powerful, that seems to be a weaponry of sorts that can go and take down anybody, and or seemingly a good amount of people. We end up having Hutch, who ends up also going and killing Big Man. It seems that Hutch ends up telling this device of his to go and teleport into Big Man's heart, of which it does. And then so Hutch ends up having the scroll come back to his hand, and it does, to basically tell us now that Big Man is dead, but we don't actually see that anywhere on camera. It's just, oh, okay, well, this guy is just dead now. Which I'm like, God, how much of a waste do they have to have of these characters that immediately they're only there for one whole episode and then they are to be killed off. So we end up having that part of this story, and so we end up having us realize that George's rich days are numbered. We end up having George, who is to go back home to eventually find that his butler ended up having to fire all of everybody, and that eventually George is going to have to live somewhere else, and that instead of George getting seemingly 100 different kind of cooked eggs, we end up having the butler having to take the average of every single egg that George would usually have had. We end up having it to where the butler gives him the some average of what he would normally get. So, and that is, I guess, his dinner, his meal, his whatever. So we end up, and I think I have almost covered everything within these episodes. I think everything is covered. I could be wrong about that, but I think I covered a bulk of these 3 episodes because there's a lot of crap going on, and plus there's a lot of stuff that I might have also missed. But with that, and there's a lot of stuff that I probably also just like kind of like shimmied around, or it's just like, okay, this is not the exact episodes, but it's good enough because this show is a show that I honestly could like, but it's just the fact it's just like this show just there's a lot of stuff that it's like I hate that part of the show. Well, I hate this part of the show. Well, I'm getting annoyed with this show, this part of that show to show, you know? So with that said, I think it's about that time to get out of here. We'll kind of see if I want to keep watching the show. Plus, I'll also see if people are interested in viewing this review. And then so that'll tell me to keep on doing this review. But with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.